On March 17, 1943, in the heart of Berlin, a file landed with a sharp thud on the heavy mahogany desk. The impact was so forceful that coffee splashed from the porcelain cup, staining the papers sprawled across the table. The room, dimly lit by the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, seemed to grow colder in that moment. The file was not just another intelligence report. It was an explosive document, one that could easily cost lives if it fell into the wrong hands, especially the Gestapo's. Inside, it contained information that defied everything Nazi Germany had believed about the capabilities of its enemies. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the German Military Intelligence Agency, found himself momentarily paralyzed, staring at the file. His hands trembled as he reached for it. It was a struggle to steady his fingers as he carefully opened the document. The intelligence report was not just troubling. It was a direct challenge to the very core of Nazi ideology. It stated, with chilling precision, that in the United States, at the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, a B-24 Liberator bomber was being produced every single hour. Each aircraft, a marvel of engineering, was constructed from more than 1.5 million parts. The implications of this report hit Canaris like a thunderclap. For a man who had seen countless reports over the years, this one was different, unlike anything he had encountered. His mind raced as he tried to absorb the magnitude of what he was reading. The notion that America could produce such an advanced and complex war machine at such a pace was utterly foreign to everything he and his colleagues had been taught. It was inconceivable. The Germans had prided themselves on their military might, their efficiency, and their technological superiority. And now, this report suggested that the Americans, whom the Nazis had so often ridiculed as weak and incapable, were outpacing them in a way that seemed impossible. As he scanned the document, Canaris's eyes darted over the numbers again, trying to make sense of them. He paused, rereading a specific line. 1 B-24 Liberator every hour. It didn't seem real. The scale of production was staggering. For a man who had seen firsthand the complexity of military manufacturing, this defied all logic. How could a single factory produce a bomber every hour? It was a feat that would have been beyond even the most optimistic projections for German factories. His mind reeled with questions. How had the Americans managed to build such a machine? Could it really be true? His training, his experience, told him that this had to be propaganda, an exaggeration, a product of some clever American trick. Yet, he could not escape the nagging thought that perhaps it wasn't. Could it be that the Allies had surpassed Germany's industrial capabilities in ways he could not yet comprehend? Canaris took a deep breath, attempting to steady his thoughts. This report was dangerous. If it were true, it would mean that everything Germany believed about the war, about their enemies, about the inevitability of victory, was wrong. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and Canaris knew that the consequences of this information being accepted or rejected could change the course of the war. He could almost feel the pressure of the world on his shoulders, knowing that his next steps would have to be taken with the utmost caution. The doubts and fears gnawing at him were almost too much to bear. He had spent years in his position, leading the German military intelligence efforts, making decisions based on the belief that Germany's enemies were weaker, disorganized, and technologically inferior. Yet this report suggested otherwise. It suggested that the United States had built an industrial war machine that could rival anything Germany could produce, even surpassing it. The thought was almost too much to accept. Canaris closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. His thoughts were a whirlwind, caught between disbelief and the painful truth that perhaps, just perhaps, this was reality. Could Germany truly be losing the war not just on the battlefield, but in the factories where the future of the conflict was being forged? He knew he would have to present this information to his superiors, but he also knew that it would be met with resistance. Göring, Himmler, and Hitler himself were all deeply invested in the idea that the Nazi regime was invincible. They could not accept the notion that their enemies were capable of outproducing them on such a scale. It would be too humiliating, too dangerous for the leadership to acknowledge. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the room, Canaris knew that the report in his hands was more than just a piece of intelligence. It was a turning point, a critical moment in the war, one that, if acted upon, could change the entire course of history. But first, he would have to convince the men in charge to believe the unthinkable. And that would be no easy task. The truth, as always, was a dangerous thing, and sometimes people were unwilling to face it. In January 1941, as the war continued to unfold across Europe, German military intelligence received a troubling report. General Karl Kohler of the Luftwaffe presented a detailed briefing that outlined a startling claim. According to military attachés stationed in Washington, the United States was on the verge of producing 2,000 aircraft per month. The numbers were staggering, but they came from reliable sources, and yet they were met with skepticism from the highest echelons of the Nazi leadership. The figures from Kohler's report should have raised alarms. The numbers were so far above anything that Germany had anticipated from the United States that it should have forced an immediate reevaluation of strategy. But the response from those in power was not one of concern or urgency. Instead, it was one of ridicule. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and a key figure in the Nazi military apparatus, dismissed the report with laughter. In Göring's eyes, the idea that America could produce so many planes seemed preposterous. His dismissal of the report reflected a deeply ingrained belief that the United States, despite its size and resources, could not possibly compete with Germany's sophisticated war machine. In his mind, Americans were only capable of building refrigerators and razors, not advanced military aircraft. This worldview was rooted in a deep-seated underestimation of the industrial might of the United States. For Canaris, the head of the German military intelligence agency, the situation was far more complex. He understood the limits of the Nazi leadership's perspective. Germany, with its obsession on ideology and racial superiority, had long ignored the economic potential of its adversaries, particularly the United States. The propaganda machine within the Third Reich had painted the Americans as weak, inefficient, and inferior. This belief had become so ingrained in the Nazi mindset that the notion of American industrial superiority was simply too difficult to accept. Yet, Canaris was not so easily convinced. He had been involved in intelligence work for years and had learned to respect the power of industrial production, even if it was outside the narrow confines of Nazi ideology. He had witnessed firsthand how the German war effort was driven by its factories, its ability to churn out weapons and equipment at a relentless pace. He knew the critical importance of mass production in any modern conflict, and he was starting to see the first signs that the United States was embracing the same methods. Reports from other intelligence officers, including those from Mexico and Latin America, suggested that the United States was mobilizing its industry for war on a scale previously unimaginable. These were not just isolated pieces of information. They were consistent and increasingly detailed. However, each new report was greeted with the same skepticism as Kohler's initial briefing. The assumption within the higher echelons of Nazi leadership was that these reports were simply another example of American propaganda, designed to inflate their own capabilities and create doubt within the ranks of Germany's military leadership. The refusal to believe the growing evidence was a systemic problem. Those in power were not just ignoring information. They were actively rejecting it because it contradicted their own worldviews. The intelligence officers, including Canaris, found themselves in a difficult position. They had the data, the reports, and the sources, but they also understood that presenting this information to their superiors would likely lead to dismissal. How could they convince the leadership to believe in a threat that seemed so far-fetched, especially when that leadership was convinced of its own invincibility? Canaris began to realize that the real problem was not the lack of information. It was the refusal to accept the truth. Each new report that confirmed the United States' production capabilities only seemed to harden the resolve of those who refused to acknowledge the rising American industrial power. The ideological framework that shaped the decisions of Nazi leadership was too rigid to accommodate such a reality. The belief in the superiority of the German race, the conviction that only a few elite nations could produce at such a scale, made it impossible for the leadership to accept that the United States could be operating on an entirely different level. Despite the mounting evidence, the reports continued to be dismissed. The messages from the field agents became increasingly dire, and yet they were ignored. There was a cognitive dissonance at play, a mental block that prevented the Nazi leadership from truly processing the scale of American industrial output. The idea that a democratic nation, composed of diverse peoples, could outproduce the mighty German war machine was simply too threatening to their worldview. And so, the intelligence gathered by Canaris and his agents remained largely ignored, discarded as mere noise in the grand narrative that had already been constructed about the war. The reports that were meant to serve as warnings were not believed, not because they lacked credibility, but because they did not fit the ideological framework that had been built over years of Nazi propaganda. The leadership of Nazi Germany was not prepared to accept that their enemies might be capable of anything more than what they had been told, and this would prove to be one of the most costly miscalculations of the war. As the months passed and more intelligence arrived from across the Atlantic, the divide between reality and perception grew wider. The refusal to believe in American production capabilities became not just a matter of intelligence, but a matter of ideology. Canaris watched in frustration as his reports, filled with facts and figures, were dismissed as part of a broader American deception. It was a failure of perception that would have devastating consequences for Germany as they continued to ignore the truth that was staring them in the face. The problem was not that the information was inaccurate, it was that it conflicted with the beliefs and assumptions that had been ingrained in the minds of Nazi leaders. The reports, despite being accurate, fell on deaf ears because they didn't fit the narrative that had already been constructed. And so, the war effort continued based on a foundation of flawed assumptions, leading Germany into a conflict it was ill-prepared to win. As the intelligence failures mounted, it became clear that the real battle was not just on the front lines. It was within the minds of those in charge, where the battle for belief, perception, and reality would determine the ultimate fate of the war. In 1943, as the war raged on and the gap between Germany and its enemies began to widen, the German intelligence service continued to gather reports from all corners of the globe. One particularly noteworthy report arrived from Mexico, which provided more disturbing details about the scale of American industrialization. The information came from various sources: American businessmen, Mexican industrialists, and even foreign diplomats who had been moving freely across the Americas. The reports they provided painted an increasingly clear picture of the immense industrial machine that the United States had become. These sources, initially dismissed as rumors or exaggerations, began to hold more weight with each new report. The more pieces of intelligence that arrived, the more undeniable it became that something extraordinary was happening in the United States. It wasn't just the official reports from spies that corroborated this information, but also the casual observations of business people, diplomats, and others who were in a position to see firsthand the massive scale of American production. The reports were filled with details, some specific, some vague, that began to draw a disturbing conclusion. The United States was rapidly becoming an industrial powerhouse on a scale that far exceeded anything that had been expected. One of the most valuable sources for German intelligence in Mexico was Georg Nicolai, a seasoned agent with years of experience in the field. Nicolai had cultivated relationships with key individuals who had access to vital information about American manufacturing capabilities. He had developed a network of contacts within the business community, which included those who frequently traveled between the United States and Mexico. These contacts, many of whom were unaware of their importance to the German war effort, were providing a steady stream of information about the incredible pace of American industrial production. Nicolai's reports from Mexico were clear and detailed. According to the sources he had cultivated, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was turning out more bombers in a single day than the entire German aviation industry could produce in a month. This was not an isolated observation, but a consistent report from multiple independent sources. American businessmen had visited the plant and spoken freely about what they had witnessed. An assembly line that seemed almost magical in its efficiency, where planes were being assembled at a rate that defied belief. Mexican industrialists, who had business dealings with American companies, reported seeing the same thing. These reports began to pile up, each adding to the growing body of evidence that the United States was capable of outproducing Germany in the most critical aspect of the war: aircraft manufacturing. As the intelligence continued to filter in, it became increasingly difficult for German military leadership to ignore the scale of the American effort. In Berlin, the reports caused a great deal of anxiety, but they were also met with skepticism. It was difficult for German officers to accept that the Americans could be so far ahead in their production capabilities. Their internal belief in the superiority of German technology and manufacturing had been so firmly entrenched that the idea of an American factory outproducing their own was almost unthinkable. Despite the clear evidence, many German intelligence officers, like their political superiors, were reluctant to believe the truth that was unfolding before them. Nikolai's sources had provided some of the most compelling evidence yet. He reported that workers at the Willow Run plant, many of them women and African Americans, were able to produce bombers at an incredible rate. These workers, many of whom had never before worked in an industrial setting, were being trained in a matter of days and were then able to perform the same tasks repeatedly on the assembly line. The scale of the operation at Willow Run, with its assembly line stretching for miles and producing bombers by the hour, was unlike anything seen in Germany. It was a perfect example of mass production, something that German industry, despite its efficiency, had never truly embraced on the same scale. The Mexican reports were not the only source of information. As part of the intelligence-gathering process, Germany had developed contacts with a number of foreign diplomats, including those from Spain, who had access to American industry. These diplomats, often unaware that their conversations were being listened to, would describe the technological marvels they had witnessed in America. Among these diplomats was a key Spanish contact who, in 1943, reported details of a meeting he had had with an American production chief. The information he relayed about the construction techniques and assembly line process at the Willow Run plant further confirmed what had been reported by Nikolai's network. This was no longer a case of isolated rumors or speculative reports. It was becoming clear that the United States had developed an industrial machine that could outproduce Germany in terms of sheer volume. As the intelligence continued to come in, the Germans found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. While they had accumulated significant evidence from various sources, there was a deep reluctance within the leadership to accept that the United States was capable of such feats. The evidence that had been gathered from a wide range of sources was too consistent to dismiss, yet the leadership's inability to process the information effectively prevented any meaningful action from being taken. The reports from Mexico and elsewhere painted a picture of American factories operating at a level that Germany could not even imagine. But each time this information was presented, it was met with resistance. Even as German intelligence officers worked tirelessly to connect the dots, the leadership refused to acknowledge the magnitude of what was happening. At the same time, the growing network of spies and informants, including those in Mexico, continued to report more troubling details. As the Allies increased their efforts to mobilize their industries, these agents found themselves increasingly caught between their duty to deliver the truth and the reality that their superiors were not willing to accept it. Each new report was a blow to the worldview that Germany had carefully constructed, a worldview in which their enemies were always inferior, their industrial capacities always limited, and their technological advancements always lagging behind. For German intelligence, the year 1943 became a time of mounting frustration. They had gathered an impressive array of data from diverse and reliable sources, but that information was rendered ineffective by the refusal of those in power to accept it. It was a situation in which facts, no matter how compelling, were disregarded because they conflicted with the deeply ingrained beliefs of the Nazi leadership. As the reports continued to pile up, the Germans were faced with a grim reality, one that, for all their intelligence, they had yet to recognize fully. The United States had become an industrial juggernaut, and the Nazis were woefully unprepared for the consequences of that fact. The growing network of spies in Mexico and beyond had provided more than enough evidence to warn them, but the refusal to believe the truth would have devastating consequences. On February 20, 1943, in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat at a large wooden table, surrounded by a mountain of documents, reports, and photographs. He had gathered the most compelling evidence yet, all of it pointing to an undeniable fact. The United States was producing aircraft at an unimaginable rate. The documents covered a broad array of sources: intelligence reports from agents in Mexico, testimonies from businessmen, engineers, and even diplomatic communications from neutral countries. These reports all corroborated each other, painting a picture of American industrial power that was unlike anything Germany had ever seen. Canaris knew that the information was accurate, but he also knew the difficulty of confronting such a reality. With a sense of urgency, Canaris carefully laid out all the evidence before Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe. He had hoped that presenting the facts would force Göring and the other leaders to acknowledge the scale of the threat. The documents on the table spoke for themselves. Photographs showing the vast assembly lines of the Ford Willow Run plant, reports of production numbers, and accounts of workers tirelessly churning out bombers day after day. The evidence was overwhelming, and Canaris believed that this time there would be no room for denial. But when Göring looked over the documents, his reaction was swift and dismissive. He picked up a photograph, turned it over in his hands, and laughed derisively. He threw the photograph back onto the table, his tone laced with contempt. He sneered at the very idea that the Americans were capable of such production. To Göring, it was unthinkable that the Americans, whom he and many others had so long regarded as weak and inefficient, could possibly be outproducing the Germans. He accused the reports of being nothing more than fabricated propaganda. To him, it was simply impossible for the Americans to achieve such feats. Canaris stood motionless, stunned by the response. His mind raced, trying to comprehend how his superior could dismiss such conclusive evidence. He had seen firsthand how reports could be misinterpreted or ignored, but this was different. The evidence was right there in front of him, meticulously gathered from various independent sources. Canaris understood that Göring's reaction was not just a simple dismissal. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that had been ingrained in the Nazi leadership for years: the refusal to believe that their enemies could be as capable as they were. For Canaris, this was a moment of profound realization. He knew that no amount of evidence would convince Göring or others in the high command if it contradicted their worldview. The Nazis had spent years building an ideological structure that painted their enemies as inferior, incapable of matching the strength, efficiency, and technological prowess of the German Reich. To accept the truth that the United States was capable of producing warplanes at a pace that Germany could not match would mean acknowledging that their entire strategy, based on the belief in German superiority, was fundamentally flawed. The consequences of this refusal to accept the truth would prove disastrous for Germany. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented by Canaris, the Nazi leadership continued to dismiss the reports as lies, propaganda, or exaggerations. This rejection of reality was not just a matter of military strategy, it was a matter of ideology. The leadership's deeply held beliefs about racial superiority and the inefficiency of democracies were more powerful than the cold, hard facts in front of them. They could not fathom the possibility that a country like the United States, with its diverse population and democratic institutions, could outproduce Germany in war production. As the weeks passed, Canaris grew increasingly frustrated. He had hoped that this time the leadership would listen. He had hoped that, armed with undeniable evidence, he could convince them to change their approach and adjust their strategy. But instead, his reports were disregarded, and the refusal to face reality continued. The leadership, particularly Göring, was entrenched in their own views, and they were unwilling to entertain the possibility that Germany might be losing the war, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, where the true strength of the war effort was being forged. This rejection of the facts had far-reaching consequences. It led to a series of strategic errors that would have a lasting impact on the course of the war. By failing to acknowledge the industrial might of the United States, the German leadership continued to focus on the wrong objectives, diverting resources to weapons and projects that were ultimately ineffective. Meanwhile, the Americans were rapidly building the arsenal of democracy, outproducing Germany in the very areas that would determine the outcome of the war. In the meantime, the war in the air continued to escalate. The Allies, armed with superior numbers of bombers and fighters, began to launch massive bombing raids against Germany. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, could not keep up with the increasing number of Allied aircraft. German factories, still focused on producing tanks and other ground vehicles, were unable to keep pace with the aircraft production that was necessary to maintain any semblance of air superiority. The longer the Nazi leadership refused to acknowledge the scale of American production, the more difficult it became for Germany to mount a successful defense. For Canaris, the situation became increasingly untenable. He had tried, time and time again, to present the truth, to show the reality of the situation. But each time, he was met with resistance, with disbelief, and with disdain. It was clear to him that the refusal to believe the evidence was not just a tactical error. It was a fundamental failure of leadership. The leaders of Nazi Germany were so invested in their own ideology that they could not accept the reality staring them in the face. As the war progressed, this failure to adapt and adjust to the changing dynamics of industrial production would become one of the key factors in Germany's eventual defeat. The refusal to acknowledge the scale of American production, the rejection of the facts, and the continued reliance on outdated beliefs would ultimately lead to a collapse in the German war effort. For Canaris, it was a bitter lesson in the dangers of ideological blindness and the consequences of ignoring the truth. He had tried to warn them, but the leadership's inability to listen to reason would ultimately cost Germany the war. In the end, the consequences of this refusal to believe the evidence were clear. Germany was fighting not just a military battle, but an ideological battle, one that would determine its very survival. And as long as the leadership remained blinded by their beliefs, the war was lost before it had even truly begun. On June 6, 1944, as the Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, more commonly known as D-Day, the scale of the invasion came as a shock to the German leadership. The beaches of Normandy were soon overwhelmed by waves of American, British, and Canadian forces, supported by an unprecedented air and naval assault. The German army, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found itself completely unprepared to meet the sheer volume of Allied military power. Tanks, bombers, fighter planes, and countless other military assets poured into France with relentless speed and precision, overwhelming the German defensive lines. The Germans had expected an invasion, but they had never anticipated an assault of this magnitude. The scale of the Allied response was beyond anything the Germans had predicted, and it highlighted a critical miscalculation, one that had been brewing for years. Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, two of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime, continued to insist that the information coming from their intelligence officers about American production was either exaggerated or outright false. They had long dismissed the reports from Canaris and others within the intelligence community, claiming they were nothing more than enemy propaganda. The idea that the United States could outproduce Germany on such a vast scale simply did not fit into the narrative that the Nazi leadership had constructed. For them, the United States was still a weak, inefficient democracy, unable to match the technological and industrial might of the Third Reich. The overwhelming evidence, the photographs, the reports from spies, and the intelligence gathered from across the world had all been ignored, dismissed as lies or miscalculations. But by the time D-Day arrived, it was clear that the Allies were operating with far more military power than Germany had ever thought possible. The realization that Germany had been outproduced, outmanned, and outgunned by the United States hit like a bombshell. But for most of the Nazi leadership, including Hitler and Göring, it was too late. The war had already been lost, and they could not reverse the damage that had been done by their refusal to accept the truth. The intelligence reports that had been dismissed were now confirmed by the sheer weight of the invasion. The United States had not only built more planes, tanks, and ships than Germany had ever imagined, but it had done so with a level of efficiency and speed that left the Nazis helpless. In the face of such overwhelming power, Germany's war machine could not keep up. The key moment came when Hitler himself was shown reports confirming that American production had surpassed everything Germany had achieved. By this time, the United States was producing more warplanes, tanks, and artillery than all of Europe combined. The figures were irrefutable, but even then, Hitler and his inner circle could not bring themselves to accept the reality. They were too entrenched in their belief in German superiority, and their ideological blindness made it impossible for them to see the full scope of the threat they faced. It was a tragic irony that the very intelligence that had been dismissed as false had been correct all along, and yet the leadership's refusal to believe it had sealed their fate. For Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, the realization came too late to make a difference. Despite his years of effort in trying to convince the leadership to acknowledge the growing power of the United States, his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. Canaris had seen the writing on the wall long before the invasion, but the very people he had served were unwilling to listen to the truth. His attempts to present factual, well-sourced intelligence were consistently met with ridicule and disbelief. The stubborn refusal to adapt, to reconsider the assumptions upon which the war had been built, led directly to the catastrophic failure that followed. The refusal to believe in the reality of American industrial might did not just lead to missed opportunities. It led to a systematic collapse of the German war effort. Germany continued to pour resources into projects that were never going to yield results, while failing to invest in the areas that were crucial for maintaining military dominance. The long-range strategic planning, based on outdated assumptions and flawed intelligence, ultimately left Germany vulnerable to the overwhelming power of the Allied war machine. The failure to adapt to the new realities of industrial warfare led to a situation where Germany was fighting an increasingly futile battle, outproduced and outclassed by an enemy they had underestimated for far too long. By the time the Allies began their final push into Germany, the consequences of this refusal to accept the truth were clear. The Nazis were not defeated solely by military action. They were undone by their own ignorance and ideological rigidity. The refusal to face the reality of American production capabilities, the refusal to believe that their enemies were stronger than they had ever imagined, became a fatal flaw that led to the ultimate collapse of the Nazi regime. Germany lost the war not because they lacked information, but because they refused to believe the information they had. Their denial of American industrial power, their blind adherence to a worldview that painted their enemies as weak and ineffective, ultimately sealed their fate. Had the Nazi leadership acknowledged the true strength of the United States and adapted their strategy accordingly, it is possible that the course of the war might have been different. But the refusal to accept the truth was a crippling handicap that left Germany unable to respond to the overwhelming military and industrial forces aligned against them. The historical consequences were profound. The refusal to acknowledge the true scale of the enemy's capabilities led to catastrophic strategic errors. Had Germany recognized the production power of the United States earlier in the war, they might have been forced to shift their focus to more critical areas, potentially prolonging the conflict or even changing its outcome. But instead, the leadership's failure to confront the reality of their situation led to a war that was lost not by military defeat alone, but by the systematic misjudgments and ideological blindness that marked the collapse of the Third Reich. The lesson was clear. The refusal to accept uncomfortable truths can lead to the destruction of entire nations. In the end, Germany's downfall was sealed not just by the strength of its enemies, but by the weakness of its own leadership to accept reality. The refusal to believe in the facts, even when presented with overwhelming evidence, proved to be the fatal mistake that destroyed the Nazi regime. The consequences of that failure were felt not just on the battlefields, but in the very halls of power where decisions were made. Decisions that ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most powerful military regimes in history.